The 1970s marked a revolutionary period in cinema history when filmmakers began pushing boundaries in unprecedented ways. Directors explored themes of extreme violence, graphic sexuality, political commentary, and religious critique that provoked intense reactions from censorship boards across the United States and United Kingdom. These films were either banned outright, heavily edited, or restricted from public viewing for years, sometimes decades. Below is a detailed examination of 15 significant examples, reordered to provide fresh perspective on this turbulent era of film censorship. 1. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Director Tobe Hooper crafted this low-budget horror masterpiece about a group of young people who encounter a murderous Texas family led by the chainsaw-wielding killer known as Leatherface. The film was shot using a grainy, ultra-realistic visual style that made the terror feel documentary-like and immediate. The unrelenting atmosphere of horror, combined with strong implications of cannibalism, created widespread alarm among censorship authorities. In the United Kingdom, the film gained particular notoriety during the 1980s when it was added to the Director of Public Prosecution's list of video nasties, films deemed so objectionable that possessing video copies became illegal. This meant that from the early 1980s until 1999, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre could not legally be sold on videotape in Britain, a ban that lasted more than 25 years. Interestingly, the film was never officially prohibited from theatrical exhibition. It actually played in UK cinemas during the 1970s under proper certification. By the 2000s, as The Guardian noted when discussing the 2002 reissue of Straw Dogs, the restrictions on several 1970s films, including the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, were finally removed. The film became available fully uncut on DVD format. The irony of its censorship history has only enhanced its legendary status. The film helped establish the fundamental conventions of the slasher genre and influenced countless horror filmmakers who followed. Its early suppression transformed it into one of the most forbidden and sought-after horror films of its generation. 2. Monty Python's Life of Brian, 1979. The comedy troupe Monty Python created this satirical film following Brian, an ordinary and somewhat hapless young Jewish man living in ancient Judea who gets mistaken for the Messiah through a series of comedic misunderstandings. The film's irreverent and humorous approach to examining religious dogma and organized faith triggered accusations of blasphemy from religious groups. In the United Kingdom, the National Film Rating Board actually gave it a comparatively mild AA certificate, which would allow wider audiences to view it. However, local councils throughout Britain wielded considerable power over what could be shown in their jurisdictions. In practice, 11 British local councils completely banned the film from being screened in cinemas within their areas. An additional 28 councils raised the minimum viewing age requirement to X as a form of protest against the film's content. Despite these local restrictions, Life of Brian went on to achieve massive commercial success at the box office and eventually received widespread critical praise as a comedy masterpiece. The censorship controversy gradually faded during the mid-1980s as cultural attitudes became more relaxed. However, the film remains a famous historical example of how political and religious satire in cinema can provoke strong reactions and local-level prohibitions, even when national authorities take a more lenient stance. 3. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. Director Mir Zarchi created this extremely controversial rape-revenge film that follows Jennifer Hills, a young writer who travels to a remote area and is viciously gang-raped by a group of local men. After they leave her for dead, she survives and systematically hunts down each of her attackers to torture them in turn. The graphic depiction of the assault scenes earned the film immediate infamy. In the United Kingdom, the film was never granted theatrical distribution, but it became one of the original video nasties during the 1980s when it appeared on VHS tape. Films designated as video nasties were prosecuted under obscenity laws, making their distribution illegal. For years, it circulated only through underground bootleg copies. Director Zarchi finally submitted I Spit on Your Grave to the British Board of Film Classification in 2001. To obtain the necessary 18 certificate for legal release, the board demanded approximately 7 minutes of cuts. These cuts specifically targeted the most sexualized and eroticized shots during the rape sequences. Only this censored version was permitted for release, while the complete uncut film remained effectively banned until the required edits were implemented. The film's reputation has remained deeply divided. Some view it as exploitative trash that sensationalizes sexual violence, while others argue it represents a feminist revenge fantasy that empowers the female victim. Regardless of interpretation, it stands as one of the most heavily censored films of the era, due to its extreme depictions of sexual violence. 4. The Devils, 1971. Director Ken Russell created this Baroque historical drama loosely based on a 17th-century French scandal involving alleged demonic possession and exorcism. The film depicts a corrupt cardinal and events in a convent where religious repression and mass hysteria lead to shocking scenes, including what the film portrays as possessed nuns engaging in a satanic orgy. The most controversial sequence shows nuns in a blasphemous scene involving a crucifix representing Christ. British censors were deeply horrified by the content. Warner Brothers actually cut portions of The Devils before even submitting it to the BBFC for review, hoping to preempt objections. Despite these preemptive cuts, the BBFC insisted on multiple additional deletions to reduce the explicit sexuality, violence, and bloodshed. The heavily trimmed version was granted an X certificate in 1971, but the film immediately provoked calls for complete prohibition. Many local councils throughout Britain exercised their authority to refuse screenings in their jurisdictions. Activist Mary Whitehouse's campaign groups publicly condemned the film. In America, it also received an X rating, which forced the removal of another 6 minutes of content to achieve an R rating for wider theatrical distribution. In practice, The Devils existed only in heavily Baudelarized versions for many years. The UK video release of the 1971 censored cut didn't occur until 1997. The missing passages from Russell's original vision remain largely unreleased and difficult to access. The film's enduring legacy is as one of the era's most infamously censored works, a grotesque satire examining religious and political power that proved almost impossible to screen in its intended form. 5. Salo, or The 120 Days of Sodom, 1975. Director Pier Paolo Pasolini's final film before his murder transposes the Marquis de Sade's 18th-century libertine novel to the setting of Mussolini's fascist Italy. The film graphically depicts powerful fascist libertines who kidnap 18 teenagers and subject them to systematic torture, rape, humiliation, and ultimately murder across 4 segments representing circles of perversion inspired by Dante's Inferno. The film was immediately declared obscene by authorities. The British Board of Film Classification rejected it completely in January 1976, refusing to grant any certificate whatsoever. It screened briefly at a London film club in 1977 without BBFC certification, but this led to a police raid after only a few days of screenings. The film remained effectively banned throughout Britain until the year 2000. That year, Pasolini's original cut was finally approved for both UK cinema exhibition and video release. Even today, many critics and viewers find the most extreme scenes genuinely disturbing and difficult to watch. The film presents its horrors as a political allegory about the nature of fascism and absolute power. In contrast to Britain's total ban, the United States gave Salo a limited theatrical release in 1977, though it remained controversial and difficult to see. Canada and Australia maintained outright prohibitions for decades. Salo remains notorious as perhaps the single most shocking film of the entire decade. A ferocious political statement that authorities considered too brutal and degrading to permit public viewing. 6. Pink Flamingos, 1972. Director John Waters created this midnight movie cult classic as a black comedy following two sets of eccentric, outrageous characters competing for the title of filthiest person alive. The film contains numerous shocking stunts and transgressive acts, but achieved its greatest notoriety for one particularly revolting scene in which the drag performer Divine actually consumes real dog feces on camera, an act that was neither simulated nor faked. In Britain, Pink Flamingos was never formally subjected to an outright ban, but it was widely reviled by censorship authorities. When first submitted for video release in 1989, the BBFC demanded massive cuts to the content. BBFC director James Furman's trial edit removed 3 minutes and 4 seconds of material, including Divine's infamous dog excrement scene, scenes depicting violence against animals, an explicit sexual scene between mother and son, sequences showing masturbation and torture, and the singing anus gag. Only this heavily sanitized version was permitted on UK VHS videotape in 1990. Waters's film kept returning to the BBFC over subsequent years as cultural standards evolved. By 1999, even many of the most scatological moments were grudgingly accepted by censors, though some cuts still remained in place. It wasn't until 2008, a full 36 years after the film's original creation, that Pink Flamingos was finally passed with an 18 certificate completely uncut. During the interim decades, the film became a powerful symbol of transgressive underground cinema. Its cultural impact proved profound. It was eventually cited by the Library of Congress for its cultural significance. It defiantly challenged censorship norms, and it influenced multiple generations of underground and independent filmmakers who embraced its anarchic spirit. 7. Straw Dogs, 1971. Director Sam Peckinpah's intense psychological thriller stars Dustin Hoffman as David Sumner, an American mathematician who relocates with his British wife Amy to a small, isolated village in rural England. Tensions steadily build with hostile local men, which erupt catastrophically when David is away from home and Amy is brutally gang-raped in their own house. The extended rape sequence and the savage revenge violence that David later enacts made Straw Dogs extremely controversial from its first release. The BBFC granted the film an X certificate for cinema exhibition in 1971, allowing it to be shown theatrically. However, when a video release was proposed many decades later, the censorship board took a much harder stance. In 1999, BBFC examiners flatly refused to classify the film for video distribution. They argued that one particular 4-minute rape scene appeared to endorse or suggest the dangerous idea that women secretly enjoy being raped, that Amy's fate seemed to glorify sexual violence rather than condemn it. Only after a new edit was created in 2002 that clarified Amy's hatred and trauma from the assault did the BBFC finally approve passing the film uncut for video release. This prolonged delay made Straw Dogs a notorious example of a 1970s film that was suppressed specifically for home release formats, even though it had been available in cinemas decades earlier. Today the film is available uncut and is studied in film courses as a controversial examination of masculinity, rage, and sexual violence. 8. Deep Throat, 1972. This 1972 pornographic comedy film centers on a woman who discovers she can only achieve sexual climax when her anatomically unusually positioned clitoris is stimulated via her throat. Upon its release, the film quickly became a surprising national cultural phenomenon in the United States, with mainstream audiences attending screenings and celebrities discussing it openly. However, it simultaneously ran into severe legal trouble across numerous jurisdictions. Several U.S. cities declared the film obscene under local ordinances. For example, Tampa banned its screening entirely within city limits, and Miami similarly prohibited it from being shown. These city-level bans reflected the widespread moral panic surrounding hardcore pornography in the early 1970s, as authorities struggled with how to regulate explicit sexual content. Eventually, the U.S. Supreme Court issued rulings that narrowed the legal definition of obscenity, making total bans more difficult to enforce. However, Deep Throat remained a central rallying point in ongoing legal battles about pornography throughout the decade and beyond. In the United Kingdom, explicit pornographic films were essentially unavailable for theatrical distribution at that time, so Deep Throat received no certified release through official channels. Instead, it circulated only through underground distribution networks. The film's primary legacy centers on being the 1970s most famous adult film and a test case whose censorship battles helped define the evolving legal boundaries of permissible on-screen sexuality. 9. Caligula, 1979. Director Tinto Brass created this epic historical film about the debauched Roman Emperor Caligula. The production featured a screenplay by renowned writer Gore Vidal and was financed by Penthouse magazine publisher Bob Guccione. The released version included extremely graphic content, mixing simulated and actual hardcore sexual acts, which Guccione reportedly added without the knowledge of the primary filmmakers. When Caligula reached the United Kingdom in 1980, it was treated as potentially the most controversial film of the entire decade. Customs agents seized the film print at the border, and the BBFC demanded the removal of all sexually explicit material, plus additional cuts, to reduce violence and general obscenity. Eventually, a very heavily trimmed version was issued with an X certificate, but even then, many local councils throughout Britain exercised their power to refuse screenings in their areas. The film's video debut in 1990 required even more censorship, with approximately 50 minutes cut from the runtime, essentially reducing it from hardcore to softcore content. Only much later, as societal standards gradually liberalized, were less censored versions permitted to be seen. By 2008, even passages that had been previously banned could be passed with an 18 certificate. Caligula today is remembered as a wild, excessive cult classic, legally untouchable and essentially unpublishable during the 1979 to 1981 period, but now regarded more as campy political satire, with pornographic elements, rather than as dangerous pornographic provocation. 10. The Last House on the Left, 1972. Director Wes Craven's raw, low-budget horror debut tells the story of two teenage girls who are kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered by a group of psychopaths. The killers then unwittingly seek refuge at the home of one victim's parents, where the mother and father discover evidence of the crime and enact horrifically bloody revenge on the perpetrators. The film's unflinching depiction of home invasion violence and rape was so extreme that UK censors completely rejected it. In July 1974, the BBFC flatly refused classification of any kind. BBFC Secretary Stephen Murphy wrote in his assessment that the film had absolutely no redeeming merit whatsoever, stating they could find no discernible artistic justification for the content. In other words, the film was judged too objectionable to certify under any rating category. When the distributor attempted an alternative route by asking the Greater London Council for a local exhibition license, the GLC reviewed the film and agreed entirely with the BBFC's assessment, also refusing to permit London cinemas to screen it. The film essentially languished unseen in Britain for many years. Only during the 1980s, after Wes Craven became famous for his later horror work, did the film gain retrospective showings and gradual acceptance. In summary, The Last House on the Left was effectively banned in Britain for its raw, graphic sexual violence, though in the United States it received distribution and later achieved cult classic status among horror film enthusiasts. These 15 films collectively demonstrate how 1970s cinema challenged and redefined societal boundaries around depictions of violence, sexuality, political commentary, and religious satire. The battles with censorship authorities often lasted for decades, with some films remaining banned or heavily cut for 20, 30, or even 36 years before finally being released in their intended forms. Ironically, the censorship controversies frequently enhance these films' legendary status, transforming them into cultural touchstones that continue to provoke discussion about artistic freedom, social responsibility, and the evolving standards of what society deems acceptable for public viewing.